A scribble on a piece of paper, drawn during a train ride from Portsmouth in 1951, seemingly meaningless, yet it saved tens of thousands of lives and changed the entire world's navy. This story doesn't begin with a battle, but with an obsession: how to bring a pilot home safely. In 1945, World War II ended. Across the oceans, aircraft carriers became the ultimate symbol of power. But at the same time, a silent revolution was unfolding in the skies: the jet revolution. From the UK and the US to the Soviet Union, design bureaus were racing to roll out jet aircraft. The Gloucester Meteor, de Havilland Vampire, and F-9F Panther brought unmatched speed, but also posed a new problem no one fully understood: how to land safely on a carrier deck barely over 200 meters long. During World War II, aircraft like the Corsair or Hellcat could slow down to 70 knots and drop gently onto the deck. If they missed the arresting wires, the pilot simply pushed the throttle and the propeller engine would instantly accelerate. But jets couldn't do that. Turbine engines took 7 to 8 seconds to reach full power. Far too long when the aircraft was only meters from the deck. The result was a series of accidents. Engineers called it the uncontrollable transition phase. Pilots had another name: the death moment. Some stories seem buried in the past, but every time they're told, we're reminded how small yet mighty human beings can be. If you also love true stories like this, leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe, so we can keep those memories alive once more. By mid-1948, the Royal Navy had lost 29 pilots in landing accidents. By 1950, that number rose to 43. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy reported 776 Class A accidents in 1951, more than 2 serious crashes a day, most occurring in the final 30 seconds of flight. Steel barriers were erected at the end of the deck to stop planes that missed the arresting wires. But sometimes, they became the blade itself. A head-on collision at 130 knots was enough to rip apart a cockpit and ignite the fuel tank. Officers called it a barrier crash. Sailors had a blunter term: the metal crematorium. The old landing system, a straight deck aligned with the ship's axis, was designed for the propeller era. Now it had become a death trap in the jet age. Every pilot landing was gambling with fate. In an internal memo from June 1945, Admiral William T. Rashure wrote, "Currently, all carriers require aircraft to land within the final 60 feet of the deck. No safe margin remains. This design is unsuitable for jet aircraft. Accidents will continue until we make a change." But for 5 long years, no one had an answer. 1950. On the Korean Peninsula, the sound of gunfire rang out once more. War had erupted, and for the first time in history, jet aircraft were deployed in large-scale combat. The world watched in awe as the age of speed dawned, an era where steel warriors could slice through the air and defy every limit. But beneath that glory, a quiet tragedy was unfolding. Not on the battlefield, but on the very decks of ships at sea. The United States Navy, the most powerful force in the world, entered the war with unshakable faith in its technology. Massive ships like the USS Boxer, USS Princeton, USS Kearsarge, and USS Valley Forge carried dozens of F-9F Panthers and F-2H Banshees, America's pride. Yet within months, that pride became a haunting nightmare. Reports from the U.S. Naval Aviation Safety Center revealed that in 1951 alone, there were 776 Class A accidents, serious crashes resulting in fatalities or total aircraft destruction. That meant, on average, 2 major accidents per day. And more horrifying, over half of them occurred in the final 30 seconds of flight. 30 seconds, the span between life and death. Aboard the USS Boxer, during a single voyage, there were 7 barrier collisions. The USS Princeton lost 9 aircraft in just 4 weeks. on March 12, 1951, aboard the USS Kearsarge, tragedy struck. An F-9F-2B slammed into the barrier at 120 knots. Steel shattered, flames erupted. Within seconds, the entire deck turned into a sea of fire. 14 aircraft destroyed, 11 sailors burned to death, 23 injured. The firefighting system ran at full capacity, yet the flames raged for nearly an hour. When the smoke cleared, the deck was charred black, reeking of burnt oil and scorched steel paint. The official report tersely stated, "Pilot missed arresting wire, insufficient time to throttle up." But those cold words couldn't capture the trauma left in the eyes of survivors. An old sailor later recalled, "We no longer heard voices, only metal exploding and heat burning the air itself." In the UK, the situation was no better. The Royal Navy lost nearly 30 pilots in 1948 alone, with the number increasing year by year. The steel barriers, once deemed the last shield, had become the executioner's blade. They couldn't tell friend from foe, only crushing everything in their path. Engineers called them barrier crashes. Sailors had a more honest name, metal crematoriums. On deck, everyone understood. Miss the wire, and your chances of survival were almost zero. Improvement efforts were constant. The British tested the flex deck, a rubber-coated elastic deck, hoping aircraft could land without landing gear. At Farnborough, legendary pilot Eric Winkle Brown made over 40 test landings. In his report, he wrote, "The concept works, but feels like landing on a bouncing rug. No one wants to do it twice." In his personal journal, he simply wrote 2 words: truly terrifying. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy spent over $3 million developing the Davis Barrier, a mechanical barrier designed to stop a 25-ton aircraft moving at 130 knots. When it worked, it saved lives. When it failed, it wrecked entire flight decks. During a test aboard the USS Essex, the net triggered just half a second early, striking an F-2H Banshee and blowing it apart before hundreds of sailors. Whether in the UK, US, or Soviet Union, the results were the same: mangled jets, scorched decks, dead pilots. In 1 year alone, the UK and US lost over 1,000 aircraft to landing accidents, more than the combat losses in Korea itself. On the flight deck, fear became routine. Pilots landed with one hand on the ejection handle, waiting for the crash impact to pull. An anonymous U.S. pilot wrote home, "Flying out, the enemy is North Korea. Flying back, the enemy is my own flight deck." Officers knew full well, the problem wasn't skill or courage, it was the design. A straight deck aligned with the ship's axis left no escape when a pilot missed the arresting wire. But in the conservative, high-pressure post-war climate, no one dared change the international standard that had existed for 2 decades. No one wanted to be the first to break the rules. In May 1951, aboard the HMS Implacable, another explosion occurred. A young lieutenant, Michael Lithgow, 23 years old, missed the wire during landing. The aircraft exploded. He died instantly, right on deck among his comrades. At his funeral, as the honor guard stood silent, a middle-aged officer stood quietly, watching the coffin lowered into the earth. His name was Dennis Campbell. No one knew what he was thinking, but those nearby heard him whisper, "We're killing them with our own equipment." That simple sentence, sharp as a blade, awakened something the entire naval world had forgotten. Technology can never replace human conscience. And from that moment, Campbell began a journey that would change history. Not with orders, but with one question. If we can't make the deck longer, why don't we make it different? Dennis Royal Farson Campbell, a name absent from the gilded pages of history, yet the man who rewrote the fate of thousands of lives. He was born on November 13, 1907, in Southsea, southern England, into a modest family near the Portsmouth naval base, where massive ships sailed out every morning. As a boy, Campbell was captivated watching them disappear into the fog and promised himself one day he would stand on their decks. In 1925, Campbell joined the Royal Navy. 7 years later, he was selected for naval flight training, graduating with a license to fly wooden frame biplanes when the top speed of an aircraft was barely half that of a modern car. During World War II, Campbell piloted Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, so slow they were jokingly called flying tablecloths. But it was this very aircraft that helped sink the German battleship Bismarck in 1941, altering the course of naval warfare. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, a medal for bravery and dedication. Yet, after the war, Campbell didn't join the ranks of celebrated generals or renowned researchers. He was assigned to the Ministry of Supply, a place few noticed, where people sat at desks sorting through technical reports and paperwork. A small room, an old wooden desk, and towering piles of accident reports. No lab, no research team, just one seasoned officer and a relentless question that wouldn't let him sleep. After the funeral of Lieutenant Michael Lithgow, a young pilot who died in a landing accident on HMS Implacable, Campbell stood silently at the grave. Lithgow had once been his student. His death was clinically recorded. Perfect landing, missed arrestor wire, barrier collapsed, aircraft exploded. But to Campbell, it wasn't just an accident. It was a silent indictment of an entire system. On the train ride back to London, he told his deputy, Nick Goodhart, "We're killing them with our own equipment." That sentence marked the beginning of a revolution. Campbell began rereading every report, interviewing every pilot, listening to every detail. All pointed to one conclusion: the deck was too short. But he didn't think so. In his old notebook, he wrote, "We can't make the deck longer, but we can make the landing path longer, if we change the direction." The idea struck like a flash in the dark. On a train from Portsmouth to London, he took out a pencil and drew a ship on paper, tilting the landing path slightly to the left, just 8 to 10 degrees. The deck stayed the same length, but if a plane missed the wires, it wouldn't slam into the barrier. It would veer safely off into the sea. Campbell stared at the simple sketch, wondering, could it really be this simple? A single pencil stroke, and it might save lives? But that one stroke opened the door to a new era. In August 1951, Campbell brought the drawing to a technical meeting at the Ministry of Supply. In the room were Rear Admiral M.S. Slattery, Lewis Boddington, technical director at R.A. Farnborough, and several veteran engineers. When Campbell unrolled the paper showing the angled line, the room fell silent. Then laughter broke out. One person said, "Impossible. International rules say landing paths must be parallel to the ship's axis." Another added, "An angled deck means the plane lands sideways. It'll slip off the ship when hitting waves." Campbell said nothing. While everyone argued, Lewis Boddington, the only one not laughing, spoke up. "If you don't believe the theory, test it." Testing, that one word opened the way. They painted a white line angled 8 degrees on the deck of HMS Triumph, changing nothing else. Over 3 weeks, dozens of pilots practiced landing along that painted line. The results exceeded all expectations. Not a single crash, no sense of directional confusion. Pilots adapted after just a few tries. One wrote in his report, "For the first time, I missed the wire without fearing death. I throttled up, flew off, and came back safely." Campbell stood on the deck, watching the white line gleam in the sunlight, knowing that the craziest idea might just be the right one. When the report was submitted, many officers remained skeptical, claiming it's just a psychological effect. But Rear Admiral Apollo Suchek, the U.S. Navy's representative in London, witnessed it firsthand. He immediately cabled Washington. The British angled deck concept may end barrier crashes. Recommend immediate trials. And just months later, aboard the USS Midway, the US painted its first angled landing line. During that test, when an F-9F Panther missed the wire, it didn't crash into the barrier. It veered off and soared safely back into the sky. No explosion, no twisted metal, just cheers from the crew. One officer whispered, "Maybe this Brit just saved the whole fleet." Dennis Campbell wasn't a genius in a lab. He was simply someone who dared to ask the question everyone else avoided. And sometimes it's the ones who dare to think differently who truly change the world. In September 1951, aboard the aircraft carrier HMS Triumph, an 8-degree angled white line was painted on the deck. No structural changes, no new equipment, just a slender stroke like a pencil mark. But to Dennis Campbell and Louis Boddington, it wasn't just a painted line. It was a gamble. If it failed, their careers would be over. If it succeeded, thousands of lives could be saved. For 3 weeks, pilots landed along that angled line. No arresting wires, no barriers. At first they were surprised. Then they adapted. Then they trusted it. Not a single skid, not a single accident. One pilot said, "First time I missed the wire and still smiled." That quote, later, was written down by Campbell in his notebook. He didn't smile, just looked down at the deck and quietly said, "They're safe now." When the results were sent to the Admiralty, many officers remained skeptical. But Rear Admiral Apollo Susek of the United States, who was present in the UK, had seen it with his own eyes. He sent an urgent cable to Washington. The British angled deck concept may eliminate barrier crashes. That endorsement opened a new chapter in naval history. Just a few months later, at the Patuxent River Base in Maryland, the U.S. began similar trials. An 8-degree angled line was painted on the deck of the USS Midway. This time, the American pilots, proud and tough, were doubtful. When veteran British test pilot Eric Winkle Brown came to give a briefing, one pilot shouted, "You want us to land sideways? That breaks every rule." Brown simply replied, "Yes, it breaks every rule, but it saves lives." Test flights began. An F-9F Panther missed the wire, heading toward the deck's edge, normally a moment of death. But instead of exploding, it veered left and soared back into the sky. Safe. The deck fell silent. Then cheers erupted. "Nobody died," someone shouted. The next day's report contained just 2 lines. No accidents, no damage. Pilots adapted quickly. From those first painted lines, Campbell and Boddington proved that sometimes, to change the world, all you need is to change the angle, literally. By 1952, the U.S. Navy decided to take the final step, fully retrofit the aircraft carrier USS Antietam, CV-36. A 200-foot-wide angled deck, slanted 8.5 degrees to the left, was installed, along with a new arresting wire system and optical landing guides. In January 1953, the Caribbean Sea welcomed a historic test flight. Pilot Harold L. Buell, a veteran who had survived dozens of barrier crashes, was chosen to be the first to land. Flying an F-9F Panther, he radioed, "Panther Ball 3.2. Roger Ball." Wind howled. The aircraft touched the deck, missed the wire. In an instant, Buell throttled up. The jet engine roared, the Panther banked left, and soared upward. 1 loop later, he caught the wire. Exiting the cockpit, he simply said, "I've just been born again." In 60 days, the USS Antietam completed 1,327 landings. No accidents, no explosions. Rear Admiral Alfred M. Pride, who had once opposed Campbell, finally admitted, "Sometimes the simplest thing turns out to be the greatest savior." In June 1953, a joint report from the UK and US was signed. The angled deck configuration eliminates the need for barriers and reduces landing accident risk by 75%. From that point on, every fleet began to change. Campbell received the news from Washington in a small envelope with a single line. "Angled deck works. No more deaths." He folded the letter, placed it on his desk, and quietly looked out the window. Outside, the English sky was gray and cold, but in his eyes, the sea seemed to glow. Dennis Campbell had no formal honors, no speeches. He simply told his deputy, "Good. Now they'll stop dying." After the USS Antietam completed its historic trial, the data sent back to Washington and London left no room for doubt. Landing accident rates dropped to near zero, survival rates after missed wires multiplied, and for the first time in history, steel barriers, fixtures of flight decks for over 3 decades, were removed. The revolution called the 8-degree angled deck had begun. The U.S. Navy, long proud of its engineering might, quickly realized this idea wasn't just a safety innovation. It fundamentally changed how carrier fleets operated. Without barriers and with aircraft able to recover easily after missing the wire, takeoff and landing cycles increased by 20%. A single carrier could handle hundreds of missions daily without interruption. That meant vastly superior combat readiness, something any admiral would instantly value. In 1954, the U.S. Navy officially recognized the angled flight deck as the new fleet standard. The Naval Engineering Bureau issued orders to retrofit the entire Essex and Midway classes, installing new arresting systems and adjusting deck angles from 8 to 10.5 degrees, depending on each ship's structure. Legendary American carriers, USS Hancock, USS Ticonderoga, USS Shangri-La, set sail with gleaming angled decks under the Pacific sun. On each deck, hundreds of young pilots no longer saw steel barriers or the fear of being crushed. They saw an open path to survival. Across the Atlantic, the Royal Navy quickly refitted HMS Centaur, HMS Eagle, and HMS Ark Royal. At the Ark Royal's 1955 launch in Portsmouth, Campbell stood silently on the pier. He gazed at the massive vessel, the world's first carrier designed from scratch with an angled deck, steam catapult, and optical landing system, and quietly told a colleague, "Now they will live." That line wasn't recorded in any minutes, but everyone who heard it never forgot. From that moment, angled deck became one of the great engineering legacies of the 20th century. It wasn't just the UK and US, their allies followed swiftly. In 1956, France refitted the Clemenceau with the Campbell-Boddington design. Australia upgraded HMS Melbourne, Canada modernized HMCS Bonaventure, and Japan, though carrier-less post-war, still adopted angled deck concepts into maritime engineering curricula. By 1957, nearly every Western naval power had implemented the system. The angled deck became a symbol of the industrial age, proof that a simple painted line could change how humans conquered the seas. Ironically, the Soviet Union, the West's Cold War rival, initially dismissed the concept. They claimed the angled deck was a safety crutch for the weak, arguing Soviet sailors will master machines with discipline. But by 1959, after deadly crashes aboard their trial carriers Kiev and Variag, the Northern Fleet's General Staff quietly tasked the Nevsco Design Bureau with analyzing Campbell's model. Their final report read, 68% reduction in accident rate within 6 months of adopting the angled deck design. The world was now speaking a common language, the language of efficiency and survival. Statistics from 1953 to 1957 proved the concept's overwhelming success. U.S. Navy landing accidents dropped from 647 to 321 per year. Pilot fatalities fell by over 80%. Each voyage saved hundreds of lives and preserved dozens of aircraft. But beyond the numbers, pilot psychology changed. Lieutenant James Davidson of the USS Antietam wrote in a letter to Campbell, "I've never met you, but thanks to your idea, I'm alive to write this letter. My daughter was just born. Thank you for giving me the chance to be a father." That letter was later found by Campbell's son in an old drawer. No notes, just faded ink and creased paper yellowed with time. While nations raced to implement the system, Campbell worked quietly. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1954 and awarded the CBE, Commander of the British Empire, for services to naval aviation safety. When reporters asked for interviews, he declined. "The ones worth mentioning are the pilots who trusted that painted line," he said. For Campbell, success wasn't glory. It was safe landings. Colleagues recalled that even after Ark Royal's launch, he still visited test bases, asking every engineer, "Is anyone still getting hurt?" Meanwhile, in the US, the defense industry hailed the angled deck as a symbol of Anglo-American innovation. Shipyards in Newport News, Brooklyn, and Portsmouth worked around the clock retrofitting the fleet. Thousands of young workers, many Pacific War veterans, returned to the shipyards, welding and painting, knowing they were building something beyond war, something made to save lives. From 1953 to 1957, the world witnessed the rise of modern naval engineering. The angled deck, steam catapult, and optical landing system formed a revolutionary triad that ushered carriers into a new era. No more chain reaction fires, no more glowing red steel barriers, just the steady roar of jet engines and the snapping of arresting wires echoing across the sea. The sound of order, progress, and humanity overcoming its own limits. By the end of 1957, NATO's official reports declared, "The angled deck is now the global technical standard." From then on, no carrier would ever be built with a straight deck again. The old was gone, replaced by the new, an era where man and machine were finally in harmony. And at the center of this transformation, Dennis Campbell's name remained almost invisible. He didn't appear in the press, didn't attend the U.S. handover ceremony of the USS Forrestal, the first supercarrier designed from the keel up with an angled deck. Instead, he attended a small funeral for a young pilot killed in a helicopter training accident. "A commander must be present when one of his own falls," he said. In those years, the world saw the technology, the massive steel ships, but few remembered that every great change begins with something very small: a pencil stroke, a painted line, a man who refused to stay silent in the face of death. As 1957 came to a close, the world's navies had entered a new era. Straight-deck aircraft carriers, symbols of World War II, gradually withdrew from the oceans, making way for angled decks glowing like steel arrows piercing through time. Wherever the roar of jet engines echoed over the seas, there was the imprint of one man, Dennis Campbell. Yet the man who helped save thousands of pilot lives vanished from the spotlight. No interviews, no ceremonies. When invited to the commissioning of the USS Forrestal, the world's first carrier designed with an angled deck from the blueprint, he simply shook his head and said, "I have more important things to do." That day, he attended the funeral of a young officer who died in a helicopter training accident. When asked why, he replied, "A commander must be there when one of his own falls." In 1957, the British government awarded him the CBE, Commander of the British Empire, for exceptional contributions to naval aviation safety. The ceremony was quiet. No press, no camera flashes, just a few old colleagues patting him gently on the shoulder. Campbell accepted the award, said thank you, and quietly returned to his desk. Years later, after his death, the medal was found wrapped in an old newspaper, tucked in a drawer next to a yellowed letter from an American pilot. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be a father." A short sentence, yet within it, a life and a world of gratitude. After retirement, Campbell became an advisor to Hawker Siddeley, which was developing the Harrier, the world's first vertical takeoff and landing jet. In every meeting, he asked the same question: if this system fails in stormy weather, will the pilot survive? One engineer recalled, "He didn't believe in probabilities. He only believed in people." That was his lifelong philosophy. People before engineering, lives before statistics. Half a century later, his legacy spans the globe. Every modern aircraft carrier, American, British, French, Indian, Russian, Chinese, carries that 8-degree tilt on its deck. People now call it the standard deck. But to the pilots who've landed there, they call it something simpler: the lifeline. Dennis Campbell never claimed to be an inventor. He once said, "I didn't invent anything. I just connected 2 dots, human life and a way out." But history saw it differently. In 1970, at an international conference in Washington, Rear Admiral Harold Buell, the first pilot to land on USS Antietam's angled deck, said, "Campbell didn't just change carriers. He changed how we think about the value of life in war." A simple tribute, yet deeper than any medal. The world kept changing. Technology advanced. Giants like the USS Enterprise, USS Nimitz, Charles de Gaulle, and Liaoning were born. Their shapes may vary, but all carried one constant: an 8-degree tilt to port. Few remembered where it came from, but every pilot who touched down walked the path Campbell first sketched in pencil on a train between Portsmouth and London in 1951. Every painted line, every safe landing, was a reminder that sometimes the greatest change begins with the simplest gesture. Dennis Campbell passed away in 2000 at age 92. British newspapers offered only a few brief lines. He contributed to naval aviation safety. But for those who survived, that wasn't enough. 3 years later, former pilot Arthur Black, a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, sought out Campbell's son and handed him a handwritten letter. In it, he wrote, "I never met your father, but I lived because of his idea. I missed the wire 14 times, and every time I survived to fly again. Without that angled deck, I'd have died at sea. Please tell his family there are thousands like me." The Campbell family framed the letter, not out of pride, but because they knew their father had left behind something greater than medals: the chance for others to return home. Today, more than 15,000 carrier landings occur annually on U.S. Navy ships. About 8% miss the arresting wire, but no one dies. No more barriers, no more firestorms, only that 8-degree tilt, the lifeline between steel and sea. And every time a young pilot lands, they may not know Dennis Campbell's name, but they are alive because of his pencil stroke. History is not always written in gunfire or glory, but in a single line, a single thought, a single person who refused to accept death as inevitable. Campbell wasn't a general or a scientist. He was simply a man who believed that human lives were worth protecting at all costs. He left no slogans, no statues, only a lesson: never take safety for granted. We've lived through the age of speed, of steel and flame. But behind every machine are people, like Dennis Campbell, who lived, thought, and sacrificed so others could return. If you've ever seen, heard, or remembered a story like this, share it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, so real stories like these will continue to be told, reminding the next generation that courage never goes out of style.